Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to share with you more of the spooky season books I've been reading. So this is going to be horror and thriller books, basically a combination of classic horror books that I should have gotten to by now, as well as some new releases that have just come out or just coming out that I'm going to review for you here, let you know which ones are worth your time. If you enjoy spooky content all year round, definitely consider sticking around and subscribing. And all that being said, let's get started. First, let's start with the horror classics that I should have read by now. The first one is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is a book that I read because it was selected by my patron as a book for me to read this season, and I'm so glad that this book was put in my hands. They actually sent me a copy, which makes it a lot easier to read and review it, so thank you so much. And if you somehow don't know, this classic follows an unnamed woman who meets this man who quickly courts her, marries her, and brings her to his gothic mansion at Manderley. And she finds out that this man is a widower, and there she discovers more about his past wife, Rebecca, and the story goes on from there. This is a book I went into absolutely blind. I've never seen an adaptation, and I somehow avoided getting spoiled by the internet, which is why you'll see me on my channel always try to say less rather than more when it comes to plot synopsis. Is I know people say, oh, this book is 100 years old and spoilers no longer count, but if you can have the experience of reading a book like this for the first time without being spoiled for the details, it is incredibly fun. While this book is relatively old in terms of the publication date, it reads so modern because as someone who has read many new release thrillers over the last few years, many of them pull this plot and put it into the package of a domestic thriller. And so I very much enjoyed this. I'm often intimidated by classics, but in terms of the writing, the storytelling was all very accessible, easy to follow, and just a great mystery. I had so many different ideas. My allegiances kept going to different people, and I kept backtracking and going around in circles. And again, I had so much fun. Obviously, for those of you that are more familiar with the story, you might already kind of know what it's all about, but I had so much fun experiencing it for the first time. And again, I'm really glad I read this because as a reviewer, I do feel a little bit of extra responsibility to actually know what a classic book is about, because I've actually read several books that are inspired by Rebecca. And so it's important if I'm going to make those comparisons to actually know what I'm talking about. So if you can't tell, I had a great time with this book. It's a classic that in my mind completely holds up to reading in the modern day. And it's just simply a story that is told over and over again and very much came from the roots of this iconic classic. And so I'm glad that I finally know where this kind of story type and archetype of story came from, and the original completely holds up. Loved it so much. Next, let's talk about Hell House by Richard Matheson. This is a review copy because Tor Nightfire just did a re-release, so this is the new cover that's available. And so I thought it was the perfect time to finally read a classic that I've never gotten around to. I adore I Am Legend. I talk about it all the time on my channel. However, I've never gone and read the author's haunted house story, and that's simply because, as I've mentioned before on my channel, I don't tend to love haunted house narrative, especially really traditional ones. Being somewhat of a modern classic haunted house story, I kind of knew what this one was going to be about, and so it's one that I've kind of put off until now, but when I got the opportunity to review it, it seemed like the perfect time to change that. If you don't know, this follows a iconic house that has been vacant for years, supposedly haunted, and so you bring in a group of individuals that are there to investigate if there's actually something paranormal going on. This book, in terms of style and setup, feels very reminiscent of The Haunting of Hill House, which was published previous to this, and so it definitely follows the route. And with me, with haunted house stories, they seem to go down two avenues. Either it is a family moving into a house, or it is a group of investigators moving into a house, or living or staying at a house where it is already known or believed to be haunted. And so this one follows the latter, which tend to work better for me. I find them a little bit more interesting. This is one that I liked. It hit on all the classic tropes that I've come to know. And again, as an older piece, it is, well, relatively older. I always get in trouble when I call books old when they're published in, I think, the 70s. So it's a book that definitely falls into those tropes, but you can argue that it was really paving the way and popularizing a lot of those tropes that get then redone over and over again in modern books getting published now. And so I'm glad I read it. I appreciate it. I probably prefer how The Haunting of Hill House does it. I just find that one to be perhaps a little bit more cozy, a little bit more interesting to me, but I'm really glad I read this one. I still prefer I Am Legend, but again, if you're a huge haunted house fan, if you're looking to go through and fill out those missing spots when it comes to your own horror reading, when it comes to the classics and iconic books, this is one you probably want to check out. because it definitely has its place again in modern lit. Now let's switch gears and talk about some new releases, starting with A Light Most Hateful by Hailey Piper. And this is a short coming of age story that is very much in the vein of something like Stranger Things or It. It follows a young woman who has run away from home. She ends up meeting another girl. They form a friendship, and then it becomes more than that. They actually have a relationship. However, on this stormy summer night, the one friend disappears and the other friend has to go and find them and figure out where they went and hopefully run off together. This is described as Stranger Things with a queer or lesbian bent to it, and that is a great way to describe it. Hailey Piper, if you don't know, is often known for really pushing the limits of the genre, writing stories that are very uncomfortable, different, and often cosmic. This one in my mind is much more for traditional horror story or coming of age story in a narrative blend that you're going to see the tropes and is playing on things that you've seen before. So I would say that this book is far more safe than usually I see from this author, and perhaps a little bit more commercial. That being said, I did like it. I really don't have any faults with this book other than the fact that it wasn't necessarily doing anything that I haven't seen before, but I don't necessarily need the author to do that. And I'll be honest that while I love the idea that they do a lot of experimental work, some of their weird cosmic stories don't really work for me. So if you're looking to get into Hailey Piper, but you share similar taste to me where you're kind of off put by some of the like weird horror she does that's kind of off the wall, this one is actually a really good place to start. Again, it has some diverse representation, which the author always brings into their work, and at the same time just tells a really familiar, comforting story, which I think is perfect to read this time of year because coming of age stories like this are just meant to be read around Halloween. Next up, we have The Silent Key by Laurel Hightower, and this is a full-length novel. This is an author who I've read before, but I believe only their shorter novellas. And in the story, we follow a woman whose husband has just died. She is going through that grief, and then she ends up teaming up with someone and trying to investigate and find out more what happened to her husband and going down that rabbit hole. This is an author who has done some really great work in the past dealing with stories that address grief, and I've really loved those before, so I was looking forward to this one. And I was surprised to say that while I think that she can write grief and emotion very well, this one honestly felt very flat for me. Other than the first couple paragraphs, which I found to be quite compelling, I found that he didn't have a lot of sympathy or care for this character and their grief, and that was really disappointing because, again, I've read this author do these topics very well in other works, and so I found myself just struggling to really get attached to the characters, attached to the plot, and it was fine. If you're going to read a grief-driven novel, I personally would recommend something like Come With Me by Ronald Malfi, which deals with similar topics of a spouse trying to deal with their grief while learning more about what their spouse was up to, and that one is just, in my mind, so much more emotionally impactful, which is what I wanted this one to be, but at least for me, in my experience, it didn't work. Maybe it'll work for other reviewers, but I can only give my opinion based off of my experience. Next, we have The Collector by Laura Cat Young, and this follows a young man who is keeping a secret journal. He is trying to hold onto memories and keep them alive. However, this is written in a horror dystopian future where memories, specifically those of guilt, are taken away from individuals. And so the entities or superiors within this world find out, they take them to the center to help wipe their mind. It's a premise and a setup that I find very compelling. It definitely ties into other books I've read, like The Memory Police, which I thought was a really fascinating story. And it's a book where I like the premise a little bit more than the execution. I'll be honest, this is once again a story where I thought the topic sounded amazing, and when I read it, the book just kind of lacked teeth to me. In my mind, it's a really gritty, tough topic that could have been done with a lot of emotional punch and be a very memorable story, and I found it unfortunately to be very forgettable. I don't have too much more to say about it. I thought the characters were fine but flat, and the story was fine but just okay, and I just have very middling feelings towards this one. So not one I would personally recommend. Disappointed because I thought it sounded amazing in terms of what it was going to do, but I don't think it really got there. Next, we have The Paleontologist by Luke Dumas. This is the same author who wrote The History of Fear, one of my favorite books I read at the end of last year, and so I was very eager to check out their new release that is just coming out now. This follows a man who works as a paleontologist, or specifically a curator, and they are returning back home to a museum where they have not been in a very long time. There was a child that was abducted from this museum, and they really haven't dealt with that since then. However, they're coming back. When they get there, they begin to hear strange noises noises, strange things, and of course it brings up all the past. And with this book, there really is a question about whether or not this is a straight up thriller book with the case of an abduction, or perhaps if it's something more leaning into the horror and the supernatural. And while I know the answer to that, I much prefer to leave it up to the reader. I found it to be really fun going into this book, not entirely knowing where I would place it in terms of genre, and I think that that is one of the strengths of this book. If you don't know, I have a huge love of dinosaurs. I'm obsessed with Jurassic Park, and I go to every dinosaur museum I possibly can on every vacation. I'm incredibly obsessed. And while it would be easy for me to just straight up say, if you like Jurassic Park, read this, I do want to preface that I find this to be a very different story. So Jurassic Park on many levels is like a creature feature. It's kind of a campy story written in like a sci-fi thriller, and is much more about the science as Michael Crichton tends to do. This book, while it deals with a museum that has dinosaurs and all of that, it leans a little bit more into the creepy side of things, and it's much more toned down in terms of action. It's a lot more character focused. I perhaps should mention, or almost give a disclaimer, which you have to do these days, that this book is set during the pandemic, which can be almost its own trigger for a lot of people. So I do want to mention that there is talk about all the things that happen in that time period, and I think the author does a good job of setting the book in that time, making you really remember what it was like, but not really hitting you over the head with opinions and political statements in a way that can be off-putting to other readers. So I just thought it kind of set the book in a specific time and definitely brought me back to some memories, good or bad. So just be aware of that if you're someone who is personally avoiding pandemic fiction for the next few years. But the book itself is definitely focused around this case, this situation, which is utterly creepy. As I've said before, I think this author is a great writer. I do enjoy his prose. It's straightforward, but very pleasing to read. And I should mention that, again, I read a physical ARC, and while I always love to recommend people to do audiobooks, this is a time where I do want to recommend you get the physical book, because there are these research papers built within them. And within those research paper, you have all of these drawings of dinosaurs. And I really thought that it added a lot to the story. I very much enjoyed those sections. So I found this one to be creepy, suspenseful, and compelling, good characters, good writing, really all the things that I want, plus dinosaurs, which is just the icing on the cupcake for me. Highly recommend this one. If you love this author's work or want to check out them, this is a great place to start. Next, I want to talk about The Dead Take Train A by Cassandra Khaw and Richard Kadrey. This is a case where I've read one of the authors before, but not the other, so I have read a few of Cassandra Khaw's novellas and really enjoyed them, so I was eager to check out a full-length novel by them. And Richard Kadrey is definitely an author that I've been meaning to check out for a while, but story of my life, there are so many books and I just haven't gotten to their backlist yet. But this is a book that I picked up as a new release. This is a story that is set in New York City, and it's a piece of cosmic horror, and the plot is very messy. It's very character focused. It's a story where I appreciate things that they were doing. I did think the writing worked decently well, but it's the kind of story that I don't necessarily like for multiple reasons, but I do think it has some appeal to other people, so I'm going to go through that quickly as I can. So with the story, it's set in New York City, and I've talked before that there are certain books that are set in New York City or another place that I do not personally know. I don't really know the details of there. I've never visited, but the way that the author describes them can really pull me into that atmosphere and kind of bring along outsiders like me. I didn't find the case here. I felt like there was a lot of winks and nods that will be lost on someone like me that maybe would be picked up by someone who is a New Yorker or at least has traveled there before. And so for me, so much of this book is about New York City as another character and part of the atmosphere and setting in a way that just, I'll be honest, probably went over my head. In terms of the characters, they're all just very gritty and adult and kind of vulgar in a way that, again, I shouldn't have a problem with. I'm not prudish. I read a lot of books about really nasty people, but I just didn't really enjoy spending time with them. They just have a lot of dialogue and banter that I think is supposed to be funny or endearing or something, and I just found them to be a lot of crass people going around without a real point to it. I think if they had been unlikable but I'd really been pulled into the story, I'd feel differently. This book is all centered around cosmic horror, which is not my favorite genre. I do acknowledge that. So maybe I had no business reviewing a book like this, but I love the one author so much, and I've really hoped that this would be a book I would adore, because I have, again, read other books set in New York City that are phenomenal and make me excited for a city I've never been to. And this one, while it textbook should have hit me on certain levels in terms of the grittiness and the ugliness of the city and all of that, the characters, it just kind of fell flat for me. I just kind of missed the point of this book. For me, the themes, what the author was actually trying to do and say, just never really worked on the level I wanted it to, and it kind of left me wanting more, I'll be honest. And finally, I want to talk about Bluebeards Castle by Anna Villiers. And this is a piece of dark romance mashed with a gothic horror story that is inspired by a French folklore tale about Bluebeard, essentially it is this man who takes away these women to his castle and then proceeds to murder them. And so this is reimagined into a dark romantic story with some deep underlying messaging. So in the beginning of the story, it's set in the reasonably modern day. We have this woman who is taken away to this old Gothic mansion by this rich man. This is kind of starts out in a traditional dark romance way where you have this very alpha male who is very assertive and has his way, and it deals with the blurry lines of consent that you see in dark romance. However, within the story, as I mentioned, there's other layers to it, and it really starts to read on the edge of being a domestic abuse tale and getting into that. There's questions about the character being gaslit, and all of those conversations ensue, and it really spins into something more. This again is a story that plays with a lot of very specific tropes that are very intentionally done within this book, but done in a way that is meant to be very self-aware. So this is a story that definitely blurs the line between horror and dark romance, a genre that I read but I don't typically talk about it on my channel. I've done one video on it, which did surprisingly well, even though it doesn't get a lot of comments. You all are watching it, or someone is, and so I might at one point reluctantly make part 2, but I'm not sure about that, so let me know if you admit to actually wanting to see that video. But anyway, this book here really plays with dark romance blended into a gothic horror story, and while it's a little bit outside of my normal wheelhouse of recommendations here, I had a really good time with it. Obviously, you have to be interested in the topics I'm mentioning. I love that this book serves to create discussions around dark romance and the blurry consent that lives within there, not necessarily to criticize it per se, but definitely to make us question as readers why we are drawn to these types of stories and what the implications are that we love them so much. So I thought that this book was super smart, super topical, not for everyone, definitely for me. I had a really good time with it, and I highly recommend it to the right reader. Hopefully I'm not the only one who enjoys this thing. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And please give me an update on your spooky season reading. How is it going? What are you loving? What are you hating? And give me the goods down below in the comment section. If you want to stick around, subscribe, and you haven't yet, please consider doing so. I do read a lot of horror thrillers and other dark things during October and all throughout the year. And I have some great videos coming. Some of my most requested videos when it comes to Halloween content are coming in the next few weeks. So I hope you stick around, and I hope you enjoy them as much as I did putting them together. If you want to help me out more with this video, I appreciate if you give me a thumbs up, drop an emoji, even if it's just something Halloween like a pumpkin. And if you want to help me out, you can hit that little notification bell. That way you'd never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.